Rose Summerson opened the small window in the third-class carriage and got her first proper view of Paris. Someone shouted at her from the platform to put her head inside, but she ignored them. If Rose Summerson had listened to any cautionary counsel, she wouldn't be here in Paris now. She didn't want to think about that. It was best to leave her life in England behind her. She was 19 years old and full of excitement at the possibilities ahead. 8.5 hours ago, at 9 a.m, she boarded the train to Dover from Charing Cross Station, London, and caught the steamer to Calais, then the connecting service through to Amiens, and finally Paris. It had taken her 2 years of waitressing in Soho to save up enough money to buy a third-class ticket and build up a small financial cushion to tide her over. But she'd used her time well. The tailors who hung around Soho had taught her to speak French, not schoolgirl French, but real French, as Parisians spoke it. Now Rose Summerson had enough money to last 2, maybe 3 days in a cheap hostel, with 1 meal a day. After that she needed to work and find a place to stay. At Gare du Nord, the station master blew his whistle loudly, and all the doors flew open as the passengers disembarked. Rose paused on the platform for a few moments, sniffing the air. She wanted to experience Paris in every pore. The air was thick with fumes from the steam engine and harsh French tobacco. She could also smell the delicious scent of chicory-laden coffee. Pulling her cloth bag, which contained her entire worldly belongings, onto her shoulder, she went in search of her first cup of Parisian coffee. "Café, mademoiselle?" said a twinkly-eyed person behind the kiosk counter. Rose hesitated. She needed to eke out her centimes very, very slowly. Perhaps it would be cheaper to find a café further away from the station on a side street. "Anglaise!" Reluctantly, Rose nodded. She hoped after a few days in Paris people would mistake her for a Parisian. But right now her clothes, her hair, and her general look of bewilderment marked her out clearly as a foreigner. The English were barely tolerated. She knew that from her French friends in Soho. The kiosk server grinned, nodded, and handed her a well-read, week-old copy of the New York Herald newspaper with one hand. Then, checking no one could see her, a small cup of dark black coffee underneath with the other. Rose, delighted, took both and smiled, slipping a couple of sugar cubes into her cup. "Merci bien," she said carefully. "Your French isn't bad, but you have a Huguenot accent." "Oh," said Rose, turning back, wondering what the implications of that might be for getting a job in Paris. Yet, as she was absolutely determined not to lose her confidence, she brushed off the half-insult with a toss of her hair. "Do you have a job?" "Not yet. I have contacts at the Café Procope. I'm going to walk there now to ask about one." "Le Procope," corrected the server, coming out from behind the counter to get a better look at Rose. Rose gasped at her outfit. She had never seen a woman in trousers before. The androgyne took Rose's chin in her hand and considered her more closely. "Do you have somewhere to stay tonight?" Hesitating, Rose weighed up her options. It was either find a room in a seedy lodging and bar the door with as much furniture as she could push up against it, or try her chances with this nouvelle Bohemian in trousers. The latter was at least a good anecdote in the making. "I'm known as Peter," said the trouser-wearing Bohemian. "You're not French, are you?" replied Rose, hearing a slightly different vowel sound in the name. "No, I'm Danish. I came here to study sculpture at Académie Julian. Is that why you're here?" Rose shyly took a cloth bag off her shoulder and pulled out a Kodak #1 Box Brownie camera. Peter whistled through her teeth. Eastman Kodak had released its first camera to the public less than 2 years earlier, in 1888, and few, if any, were seen on the streets of Paris. "You think it's possible to be an artist with that?" Peter didn't sound convinced or impressed. "No," replied Rose, watching Peter scribble down an address. "I'm going to be a commercial photographer. I became an apprentice at W&D Downey in London. I met many Americans who wanted their photographs taken for a carte visite. Most of them come to Paris in the autumn. I thought I'd follow and find some clients of my own." "But what about art?" said Peter, going back to the counter to serve another customer off the train from Lyon. "I like to eat and have nice things," said Rose dismissively. "Then you'll like Paris," laughed Peter, handing her the slip of paper with an address on it. "It has plenty of both." When Rose got to Peter's apartment that night, it was already quite late, but she was satisfied with her first day in Paris. The kitchen manager at Le Procope had agreed to give her a shift to try her out, and she had somewhere to sleep. She pulled the bell cord. A very annoyed concierge poked her head outside a window on the ground floor. Rose had rehearsed how to ask for Peter's apartment. The concierge grunted and looked pointedly across the street at the church as its clock chimed 11, then came downstairs to unlock the heavy door. Rose ran through the courtyard to the back and headed up the staircase to the 7th floor. At the top of the stairs, Rose could hear someone doing scales on the piano, then starting to play something lovely that she'd not heard before. Just as she reached the top, the door flew open. Peter was standing there in a long robe and some sort of cotton nightwear flowing trousers. She had her finger to her lips, telling Rose to stay silent. The others were asleep. Handing her a sheet, blanket and pillow, Peter pointed to a mattress on the floor next to a painter's easel. Gratefully, Rose made up the makeshift bed and quickly got undressed by candlelight. A few moments later, blowing out the candle, Rose slipped into the icy sheets, pulled the blanket up to her chin, and looked over towards the open window. After several years of construction, the Tour Eiffel opened last March. It was still a jolt to most Parisians jutting above their familiar 19th century skyline, but a comforting one for Rose. She held up her hand towards the window, as if it could touch the Tour Eiffel itself. She was here, in Paris.
Hello, I'm Sophia Stewart, and I wanted to thank you for listening to my father reading this excerpt from my novel A British Bohemian in Paris. I also thought you might like to know it's somewhat based on a true story. Many years ago, I was living in New York. I had just returned from a long-haul flight from China and was befuddled with major jet lag, trying to catch up on emails in the back of a cab. Then I saw a message from someone who said that they were distantly related to me. I generally ignore these kinds of things, but there was something about the accuracy of the information that this person provided that made me stop for a moment. A while later, I dug into the data and became intrigued about our common ancestor, Sarah. Sarah had been born in England in the 1860s in relative poverty, but something in her character had enabled her to escape, and by the time she was 19, she had made her way to Paris. Not long after that, she married my great-great-grandfather, who happened to be well-born and in possession of a rather nice chateau in the Loire Valley. But that's not the bit that interested me. I started to picture what it must have been like to run away from England at the age of 19 and end up in Paris in the waning years of the 19th century. You see, almost 100 years later, at exactly the same age, I'd done the same thing. I was at university in London and miserable during the Easter hols. I was earning money by working in a restaurant and doing photography jobs on the side. On a whim, I decided I had to do something dramatic and ran away to Paris until term started again. I was completely broke, so went the cheapest and slowest way possible. The boat train from London, the ferry across to France, then a train to Paris the other end. And this is probably exactly the same journey Sarah took 100 years earlier. I'll never know what happened to Sarah in the intervening years, but I still have a visceral memory of being 19 in Paris. I transposed Sarah's era and then my experiences into this character of Rose Summerson. I gave Rose a camera, a place to stay, and big dreams, and then in my apartment in Los Angeles in 2021, I started to write this story.